Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're plunging into the fascinating, sometimes really intertwined worlds of magical traditions. You might have seen the images, the moonlit circles, herbs hanging up, the symbols, but what's truly real when we talk about magic? And maybe more importantly, why does that authenticity seem to matter so much for people who practice? We're taking a close look at folk magic and Wicca today, really digging into their origins and what sets them apart.
Yeah, and our mission here really is to peel back those layers, to try and understand the historical context, sure, but also the lived experience behind these practices. It's just crucial we don't dismiss one or the other, but actually get a sense of their distinct foundations, which actually it raises a pretty big question right off the bat, doesn't it? How do we even define magic today? Is it about belief
Yeah.
or something else?
That's a great frame. Okay, so let's unpack this. Maybe start with some basics, some definitions.
No.
When we talk about folk magic, well, we're also talking about things known as cunning craft, sometimes granny magic, or just the old ways. Now, this isn't really something you learn from a book, like in a formal setting. It's deeply practical, it's ancestral, and very often passed down through generations, within families, communities.
Right.
Think about herbal remedies for everyday things, protective charms maybe for the home, weather lore that people actually relied on,
Yeah.
or even working with spirits tied to like specific local places.
Yeah.
The core idea here isn't really about belief per se. It's profoundly about doing. It's about getting tangible results.
And that's where we see a really significant contrast when we bring Wicca into the picture. Wicca is, well, it's clearly a modern religion. It was explicitly founded in the 1950s by Gerald Gardner, and it draws pretty heavily from a mix of different influences. You've got ceremonial magic in there, elements of Freemasonry.
Like the structure, the degrees.
Yeah. Exactly. That gave it some of that structure, the initiations, and also a kind of romanticized view of pre-Christian paganism. Wicca brought in structured rituals, the worship of both a god and a goddess, and of course, the famous Wiccan Rede. And it harm none, do what you will. So, while Wicca often looks very witchy, the robes, the ithems, the ritual daggers, moonlit circle.
All aesthetic.
Yeah, the aesthetic. It's definitely a constructed system, meticulously built from these different threads. Folk magic, though, that feels like it's truly born from lived experience, from necessity.
That phrase, lived experience, really hits home. It makes you think how deeply folk magic was just part of everyday life. It wasn't separate, was it? And here's where it gets really interesting when we talk about how deep those roots go. Folk magic is old. I mean, really old. We're talking traditions woven into the land itself, the rhythm of the seasons, the actual survival of communities. Just picture it. The whispered charm over a sick kid, or a simple rowan twig popped above a door for protection, or even just tossing salt over your shoulder to ward off bad luck. These aren't necessarily big, elaborate ceremonies all the time. They're immediate, practical things embedded right into daily life, passed down by word of mouth, by watching.
Exactly. And we see this pattern across so many different regions, which just confirms how, well, vital these practitioners were. Take Scotland, for example. The cunning folk, they weren't just healers, they were midwives, too. Essential parts of their communities. Or in Appalachia, you have the granny witches famously blending Celtic, African, and indigenous know-how into these incredibly unique and resilient practices. And then in Eastern Europe, you see folk practitioners working really closely with ancestors and the spirits of place. Not because of some dogma, but out of this deep connection to their immediate world. And it's so important to get this. These people weren't witches in the way we think of it now, or in the Wiccan sense. They were integral members of society, often the first person you'd go to for help.
That distinction you made, necessity versus constructed practice, it just becomes crystal clear when we pivot back to Wicca. Like you said, it's a revivalist movement. It definitely borrows elements from these older traditions, no doubt, but it packages them up into a more formal religion, with specific initiations, degrees, a clear moral code. A framework. And look, to be clear, that's not inherently bad or wrong. Not at all. But it's also just not ancient. And for many people, especially those maybe seeking a connection to ancestral wisdom or a really land-based practice, that difference between a modern creation and something truly ancient, well, it matters. It really matters. And this kind of leads us to another big difference, one you can almost feel in the practice itself. This contrast between maybe performance and deeply lived experience. Folk magic is often, well, it's messy. It's not always pretty. You don't always need the perfect wand or a flawlessly cast circle. Right. It's fundamentally about results. getting something done, whether that's healing or protection or even seeking some kind of justice. It feels raw, intuitive, and yeah, often quite solitary, very personal, very pragmatic. Now, it's fascinating. There's this sort of paradox you find within folk magic itself. Like some folk practitioners, maybe historically or even now, they'd never even call themselves witches.
Their practices are just what we do or what my grandmother taught me. It's just life. But then, if we shift focus back to Wicca, for some people, not all, of course, but for some,
Right.
it can feel a bit like theater. The rituals are often scripted, the tools are very symbolic. There's often a strong emphasis on the aesthetics, the look, the feel.
The robes, the candles, the chants.
Exactly. And while that can be beautiful and deeply meaningful for those practicing it, it can also sometimes maybe evoke that feeling of, I don't know, cosplay if it feels disconnected from a deeper, lived, integrated experience. Does that make sense?
Totally. And here's maybe the parallel paradox for Wicca that really makes you pause and think. Some Wiccans never actually cast a spell. Their focus might be entirely on the religious observance, the connection with the god and goddess, the seasonal cycles.
Yeah.
So if you put those two things side by side, some folk practitioners don't call themselves witches and some Wiccans don't cast spells. What does that tell us about the very nature of magical practice itself? Is it just about belief? Is it purely action? Or somewhere in between?
Well, if we try and connect this to the bigger picture, I think it becomes clearer why drawing this line, making this distinction, feels so important to so many people. Authenticity. It really matters in these kinds of traditions. There's a genuine concern. You hear it a lot among practitioners that these incredibly valuable folk traditions are being, well, diluted, erased, kind of repackaged, and then sold back to us, often stripped of their real meaning, their history, their context.
Yeah, commercialized sometimes.
Right. And the feeling is that the wisdom of our ancestors, this deep, practical knowledge they gathered over generations, it just deserves more than, you know, a pretty Pinterest altar and a moon phase app. It deserves genuine respect, true understanding.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. And it's important to stress this conversation isn't about gatekeeping. It's not about saying one path is inherently better or more valid than another. It's fundamentally about honoring the roots, acknowledging where these practices actually come from. Like some of the sources we looked at put it, folk magic isn't a trend. For many, it's a birthright. It's this deeply inherited wisdom.
And this really brings up an important question, I think, for all of us navigating this kind of information, these spiritual or magical traditions. What does it truly mean to connect with a practice, whether it's ancient and inherited or modern and constructed? How do we engage with history, with practice, in a way that feels respectful, feels meaningful, and genuinely serves our own spiritual path, whatever that might be?
Wow. What a journey we've taken today, really diving deep into these distinct paths, folk magic and Wicca.
Yeah.
We've looked at their very different origins, their core practices, and the fundamental intentions behind each one. It's been fascinating, hasn't it? Looking at what it means for something to be truly ancient, grown for the land and the community, versus a modern construction, even one built with reverence.
Absolutely. And maybe as you, the listener, reflect on this distinction we've talked about between inherited wisdom and constructed systems, we'd encourage you to consider what it means for your practice, if you have one, to be grounded. What does real magic look like in your own life, regardless of the specific path you might choose to walk or are curious about? This deep dive hopefully has offered a framework, some ways to think about it, but the real exploration, the truly personal part, well, that begins with you.